It was a joint effort. I mean, the two were linked like two people climbing a mountain. They were linked, and in to a tragic degree, actually. This is the first self-portrait we know he did. It's about 4 years into his short career, his 10-year career, if you can call it a career. And there are a few things that need to be said about him and his background, which I think are very, very enlightening. He had some of this you know, but it bears repeating. He had an elder brother who died, who was stillborn exactly a year to the day of his birth, who was also called Vincent. So when he was a child, his mother would visit the grave and he would see his name and his birth date, just a year different, on the grave. And I think this, combined with the fact that he came from a kind of austere Protestant family. His father was a minister. His mother, actually the daughter of a book dealer. And he actually described his youth as austere, cold, and sterile. That had a formative effect on him. Also, there was madness in the family for several generations. Theo would go mad and die just 6 months after him. And his favorite sister, Wilhelmina, I guess you pronounce it that way, I'm not sure, also had attacks of madness. So that needs to be taken into account when we think about him. But I might add, there's nothing mad about him most of the time. He's very impulsive and extremely self-denying in most ways, but he wasn't mad. In fact, by the age of 15, he spoke and wrote German, French, and English, as well as Dutch. And he wrote the 700 letters he wrote to Theo, he wrote in French, and they're considered great literature. I've also read a couple of his letters in English, and they're perfect English. And one of the reasons he was so literate, apart from the fact that his mother was the daughter of a book dealer, is he was sent to boarding schools that were very demanding. At 7, he was sent to a boarding school and he was desperately unhappy and begged his family to bring him back, and they didn't. Then he was sent on to middle school and he actually eventually walked out on it. And his father, the family arranged for him through an uncle, because one side of the family, his father was a minister, but some of his brothers were in the art dealing business. So Van Gogh got a job with Gogh, a major gallery in Amsterdam, and after doing very well there, he went on. They sent him to London, where they had a gallery, and he represented them there, and for a while did very well. But he fell in love with his landlady's daughter, who refused him. And he had one of the first of his sort of breakdowns, and became outrageously religious, and ended up coming home. Well, there's a number, it goes on and on, actually, the story. There's so many parts to his journey before he starts painting. It's really hard to recount it all. But one thing that's very important is he does eventually, after failing ministry school, he volunteers as a lay minister in the Borinage in Belgium, which was a mining area, and the people there were desperately poor. And he takes his job very seriously. He has lodgings given to him by the ministry, and he gives his lodgings to a homeless person and moves into a little shack and sleeps on straw. Now, the miners loved him. They called him the Christ of the miners. But the ministry got really upset, claiming that he was undermining the dignity of priesthood. And his father came and took him home. And this was the beginning of his conflict with the established church. Anyway, he, after many more adventures, including falling in love with a cousin who rejects him, and whom he goes to her house and demands the parents let him see her, and puts his hand over a candle and said, "Let me see her for as long as I can hold my hand over this candle," and passes out. And this is an indication of something about him, which is that he will take out his emotional suffering on himself rather than attacking other people. And he does this throughout his life. There's a couple of other romantic failures. So it becomes an element in his life, which often his attacks of madness are directly related to being rejected. He has a very strong, which probably goes all the way back to his childhood. Anyway, he finally, in consultation with Theo, who's very close to him, Theo advises him to become a painter because he's always loved to draw. And an artist close to the family takes him on as a student, but they have a row after a few months, which is consistent with Van Gogh. Anyone who tried to take control of him would end up fighting with him. So he then goes on a pilgrimage, and at some point after his rejection, his fight with this teacher, he's in Antwerp at the time, he takes in a prostitute as his lover who has a child. He takes her in because he likes her and he feels sorry for her. And he thinks the little amount of money he has can support them both, but they're living in incredible poverty. This creates a big brouhaha in his family, and his father threatens to take away the little bit of income he's been giving him, because at the time his father's supporting him. And after a while, he abandons. But first, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Actually, before I did get ahead of myself, I'm very sorry. Before he went to Antwerp, before he took in Seine, the woman, he went back to the Baronage and he did some of his first drawings, which are crude but very powerful, like this one. So he takes in Seine and he has this conflict with his family. You notice she's got her skirts over a heater, a brazier. Remember, we saw these braziers in Vermeer's painting. They're a common Dutch thing, and women would put their dresses over them to warm up their whole body. Obviously very cold in the studio. And this is one of his few nudes. He didn't believe in painting nudes as let me put it this way. He wanted all his art to be expressive and to communicate to the everyday person. He saw himself as a worker doing the work to contribute to people's understanding. And he was very serious. And in these days, grief and pain and suffering were his main subject. Very powerful drawing called Worn Out. And this will show up again as a finished painting much, much later in his career. So take note of it. This drawing he turned into a lithograph too. And he said to his brother, "It seems to me that a painter has a duty to try to put an idea in his work." But I can't say it as beautifully, as strikingly as reality, of which this is only a dim reflection seen in a dark mirror. That it seems to me that one of the strongest pieces of evidence, um, for the existence of God and an eternity is the unutterably moving quality that there can be in the expression of an old man like that, without his being aware of it, perhaps, as he sits so quietly in the corner of his hearth. At the time, something precious, something noble that can't be meant for the worms. This is far from all theology, simply the fact that the poorest woodcutter, heath farmer, or miner can have moments of emotion and mood that give him a sense of eternal home that he is close to. And in his really intense effort to gain control of his drawing and gain mastery, he has this perspective frame built for him, which he describes to Theo. And for many years, he paints through the perspective frame when he's outdoors. The two legs of it are like this, and they can be driven into the ground, which is what he would do. He'd put it in front of him. He'd put the same lines on his canvas, and he would use it to get a very accurate drawing of what he was looking at. So he continues with any number of landscapes, often using the perspective frame, as in this one. I think this is one of his finest early works. It's a beautiful drawing. Notice the people in the middle distance with their backs to us. There's a certain element always of loneliness in his work. He decides to concentrate. He's back home now, and he and his father having constant conflicts. At one point, his father actually suggests he be sent to an asylum. He decides to do a whole series. He does dozens of maybe more drawings and paintings of weavers. The weaving industry was the home weaving industry was surviving in this region, but was slowly dying out as the industrial looms took over. He did some wonderful studies and paintings, though, of the weavers. Then he took on a subject, and he did hundreds of drawings and paintings of potato eaters. Here there's someone who lives on potatoes digging the ground. And he finally did what he considered would be his greatest masterpiece up to this time, the potato eaters. Of course, you got to understand the people who lived on potatoes in Europe were the most marginalized of the rural population because you could grow potatoes anywhere. And they were introduced to Europe originally by royalty to sustain the peasants, the people who actually ended up manning a lot of the armies of Europe. But this is a family, is a real family, and he did several studies of each of these people. And then he assembled this at home. It's quite a big canvas. And it's a very powerful work and kind of unique for its period. No one else had really taken on this utter poverty and suffering of so many people in rural France. He was, by the way, a great admirer of Daumier and Millet. And you can kind of see the influence here. Well, all this time, Theo's been writing to him. Theo is now the head of a gallery in Paris. He's dealing with the Impressionist painters, among others. He's writing to him about Impressionism and the new color. And he's encouraging Van Gogh to come to Paris. And Van Gogh sends him this painting, and Theo says, you know, I'm not going to be able to sell it. It's too dark. There's a whole new taste in color. So Van Gogh joins him in Montmartre, where Theo had a small apartment, and he moves in with him. And it's interesting that he picks the windmills, which remind him of home, and he's still working in this very dark palette. But over the next, he's in Paris for 2 years. He paints almost every day. Um, he's doing still lives. He's doing a lot of landscapes, cityscapes, and he's also painting portraits. He gets to know a lot of people. Van Gogh didn't have a hard time getting to know people, interesting people, and people generally liked him, at least initially. This is a famous figure in Paris at this time. It's Pierre Tanguay, who had been a member of the Commune and had been an active member of the Commune of Paris, and he'd been exiled and then pardoned. And he ran a small shop selling artist supplies to artists. And he would often, being a socialist, he would often accept paintings in exchange for art supplies. So he had a huge collection of art. So the artists would not just go there to get paint, but they would hang out there to see all his collection of works. He was the only person who had Cézannes in Paris at the time. And during this period, Van Gogh had joined the studio of Gorman, where artists could work, receive some instruction. And he met Emile Bernard. Remember, I mentioned him last time. Louis Anquetin. Toulouse-Lautrec was there, 11 years his junior. And through them, he began to meet the entire Impressionist circle. But they hung out together, and they would often hang out at Pierre Tanguay's little store. And Van Gogh here also presents a number of Japanese prints. He'd already developed a real taste for Japanese prints when he was in Antwerp and collected hundreds of them. And you can see how his color has changed, by the way. This is, so Toulouse-Lautrec and he became very good friends. And this is, I think, a wonderful pastel portrait of him by Toulouse-Lautrec. This is the very beginning of Toulouse-Lautrec's career. But notice the color in this, the use of color is quite similar to the way Van Gogh was painting Pierre Tanguay. And you know, I would encourage you to imitate one of these artists, maybe for the next week's presentation, because look how they move the colors around. I mean, this is a brown jacket, okay, but look what Toulouse-Lautrec's doing with it, and look how he's animating the whole image. Well, this was painted in a restaurant run by an Italian woman, Augustina Segatori, who apparently, according to most sources, at a certain point was having an affair with Van Gogh. And he did an exhibition in her restaurant of his Japanese prints. And he also painted, and he painted Japanese prints to learn more about them. But he also painted her in this very brightly colored manner. And this is sort of begins to suggest where he will be going with his color and his painting. They ended up having a blowout and breaking up, which was kind of the story of his life. Oh, by the way, she had, in her youth, she'd modeled for Corot and for Manet. So she was very well, but unlike many women, she managed to use the money she gained from that to actually open a restaurant. She looks like she has a very strong personality here. He also painted around the outskirts of Paris. He moved to this area, this part of Paris, after it became apparent that he and Theo couldn't live together anymore. Theo said it was becoming almost unbearable to have Van Gogh around all the time. He's so intense. Um, so, and out in this region of Paris, northwest of Paris, he was very close to Signac studio, and they became good friends. And Signac later, Signac, by the way, is one of the leading pointillists along with Seurat. We painted on the banks of the river and ate in a country cafe. And we returned on foot to Paris through the streets of Saint-Ouen and Clichy. Van Gogh wore a blue zinc worker's jacket, smock, and painted colored smudges on the sleeves. Well, he meets all these artists. I should say, again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I will go back actually. While before he leaves Paris, he mounts a show in a restaurant, another restaurant of his work and the work of Émile Bernard, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Louis Anquetin. And a lot of the other artists, Pissarro's son, I believe Renoir and Monet actually visited the show, and the artists, they would all hang out together and talk art. And Van Gogh really felt like he was in his element, and he formulated the idea of an artist colony in the south of France. Lautrec had already told him that Arles in the south had light very much like Japan. I don't know exactly where he got that information, but so Van Gogh was very excited to go to somewhere that in some way had the appearance of Japan. And he wanted to start a studio, and he wanted some of these artists who he'd got to know to join him there. In particular, he was interested in having Gauguin, who had made the acquaintance of Van Gogh and Theo after they had admired his paintings of Martinique. He was particularly interested in having Gauguin and some of the other members of the Pont-Aven school join him in Arles. So he heads for Arles. On the way, by the way, on the way to the station, he does a quick visit with Theo to Georges Seurat's studio. And then he takes the train, 14-hour train ride to Arles. And he arrives with the spring. And he has a few words to say about that. There's a hard frost here, and out in the country, there's still snow. I have a study of a whitened landscape with the town in the background, and studies and two little studies of a branch of an almond tree that's already in flower despite everything. And later he would go out and he would paint a whole series of the almond trees in blossom. They're the first thing to blossom in the spring. So it was a very significant image for him. He also discovers these bridges in Arles, which remind him of Holland. And he did 4 paintings and a number of drawings of this bridge. And somewhere I have something he has to say about. Oh, I know, it's the next one actually. But I think you can see he's very happy here. There's a joyfulness to this, and there's a relaxed quality to this painting. He's in complete control. And he also sends a letter to Émile Bernard, because he's corresponding a lot with the Pont-Aven school, Gauguin and Bernard and other painters there. And he says in this, well, it's mostly a description another one of these paintings of the bridge, but he also remarks on how much this is like um, Japan, and that the colors are just marvelous. Now he's in Arles for about 3 months, staying in a room above a cafe, which he will paint, the Night Cafe. And he gets to know actually the owners very, very well. They become some of his closest friends in Arles. But he finds this little house and he rents it for a pittance. I mean, one of the reasons he went south was because it was very cheap to live there. And remember, well, I don't think I mentioned in this talk, but since very early on in his painting career, Theo very generously offered to support him on his salary. So Theo is giving him almost half his salary to continue painting. And this how, and but in all this money went a lot further in the South than it did in Paris, obviously. Note that the perspective in this one is kind of wonky. He was starting to paint extremely fast. Some of his paintings were done in 2 or 3 hours. And most often, even his real masterpieces were done in a day. He said to his brother once, "I paint like lightning." So during all this time, both he and Theo are trying to get Gauguin to join him, and he's preparing the house for Gauguin's arrival. Gauguin is sort of putting them off. He's got a whole huge following in Pont-Aven, and he likes being the leading painter there. But he needs money, and Theo's offering to support him in Arles. So, but in the meantime, Van Gogh prepares the house, and he paints a whole series of paintings to decorate the house. This is his bedroom, and he was trying to convey a sense of rest in this painting. Theo, his sister Wilhelmina sends him a photograph of his mother around this time, and he says, "I can't stand looking at the black and white," and so he does a painting from the photograph. He's also ranging now far and wide, both around Arles, but into the countryside. He goes on long walks, day-long walks, and sketches with a bamboo pen. And he does dozens or maybe hundreds of sketches like this of the landscape, which he finds striking, and they're gorgeous drawings. And they reflect also, though, the Northern tradition. Remember, this guy is a Northerner from Protestant Holland, where there's a huge tradition going all the way back to Dura of woodcuts and etchings and engravings. And even though this is an ink pen drawing, it reflects that tradition. He finds wonderful scenes in the countryside. This is an old mill, and it's one of 7 paintings that he sends to Pont-Aven. This one to Gauguin, actually, because he's got the artists. He's organized the artists to trade paintings with one another. And those days, postal service was much better and faster than it is today. So these paintings would have arrived in a couple of days, crossing France north and south. He also takes a stagecoach south to it's not that far. I think it's 30 kilometers or more to Saint-Marie, les Saint-Marie de la Mer, where he stays for a week, does 2 oil paintings and a whole bunch of drawings. This is my favorite of his oil paintings that he did there, of boats that you hardly see anymore in the Mediterranean. I saw a few of these boats in southern Italy and and Greece in the 60s, but they barely exist anymore. But it's a really gorgeous painting. And feel free to interrupt me at any time. I mean, here he's using these very strong colors set off against quite muted notes. It's very effective here. Well, he finds a young Japanese girl to paint, which is appropriate since he's seeing Arl through the lens of the Japanese prints that he's been painting. This would have been done I don't remember, but these were done very, very quickly, these portraits. And one thing to understand about his portraits is he didn't do just one. He'd do an original, which he would often give to the person who sat as payment. And he'd do 1 or 2 or 3 copies for himself. And they don't look exactly the same. He will vary the color. You keep the drawing usually very much the same, but experiment with the color. So it's a little confusing. You think you've seen a particular painting and then you see it again and it doesn't look the same. And that used to confound me in the beginning. He also finds this Zouave to paint. If you remember, Basile joined the Zouaves and was killed in the Franco-Prussian War. This is a Zouave who's obviously of North African origin. And I'm missing some notes here. Just bear with me for a second. He's got the traditional North African garb and apparently shared a lot of great stories with Van Gogh. Van Gogh would have these very deep and intense conversations with his sitters, which he would usually relate to Theo. Look at the texture on the wall. He loved the texture of oil paint, and he would lather it on. This is one of the reasons that he was buying an enormous amount of paint, and he was going through so much paint that he would starve himself. He would live for weeks on bread and coffee and alcohol and tobacco, which could be as much the cause of his mental problems as anything else, if you think about it. And of course, he gets to know several families there very well. The Roulin family was one of them, the postman, the whole family. The postman posed for him several times. The entire Roulin family eventually posed for him. I'm not going to show you them all, but look at the depiction of the face here. The thing about his portraits is this sense of direct contact with the person. Van Gogh was highly empathetic, maybe too empathetic for his own good. And it shows in his portraits. Well, during this whole period, he was mulling over the idea of night paintings. He wrote to his sister Wilhelmina. He was inspired, he said, by imagery in the poems by Walt Whitman. He was reading, he sees under the great starlit vault of heaven a something which, after all, can only be called God and eternity in its place above the world. He would also say about night paintings, when he accomplished this one, it does me good to do something difficult, but in no way changes the fact that I have an immense need for, should I use the word, religion. And then I go out at night into the open and paint the stars. And I always dream of such a picture with a group of lively, friendly figures. There are figures in this which are very hard to see. It's a couple down at the bottom. Can you see it?
Yes.
And if you become aware of it after a while, his many of his paintings are peopled by a couple. And I think it has to do with the fact that the thing he desired most of all was to have a real uh, companion in life, which of course he never succeeded in doing. This one was painted actually on the banks of the Rhone, a short walk from the Yellow House. And he's playing the natural light of the stars against the artificial lights. These kind of artificial lights were fairly new at the time that he was painting. He also paints, of course, the exterior of the night cafe, which is where for the first 3 months he lived. And where he made his closest friend in Arles. I'll be talking about her later. This is the interior, and he said, painting this, he had emphasized those terrible colors, those the opposites of red and green, those terrible colors which represent human passion. And excuse me, those colors which represent terrible human passion. And it was a place, he said, where you could destroy yourself, staying up all night, drinking coffee and absinthe. The final night painting that he did in Arles. This one would definitely have been a studio piece, though. This was not painted on site. I don't believe. So in preparation for Gauguin, he also paints his own chair, expressing who he thinks he is. It's a very simple kind of workman's chair with just his tobacco, which he smoked all the time, and Gauguin's chair, the way he saw Gauguin, a much more fashionable chair, and very different colors. And books. But of course, both of them were voracious readers, really fine writers, as well as being painters. And they shared a lot of the same ideas. They had a very lively correspondence. And to decorate Gauguin's room, he paints a series of sunflowers. He painted, I don't know how many sunflowers he actually painted, but he did numerous copies. So it's hard actually to know which are the originals and which are the copies at this point. These sunflowers would have a huge impression on Gauguin, as I noted last time, where very late in his life he did his own Gauguin, his own sunflower series. But the sun was also a powerful image and source of inspiration to Van Gogh, because in the South he discovered a really powerful sun. And he's one of the few painters, apart from Turner, who would put the sun in his paintings so frequently. This is based on a Millet painting of the sower. To me, this is one of the greatest paintings of a peasant. It was Patience Escalier, a gardener and shepherd. So Gauguin arrives, and the first thing they do is go out and paint the Allées Champs, which are very famous. It's the road leading out of Arles, which is lined with tombs, which and the oldest tombs date to the Roman period. And it was autumn now, so the leaves were turning on the trees. So this is Van Gogh's painting, though it shows some influence in terms of his color of Gauguin. This is Gauguin's painting, which I showed you last time. You notice he avoids the tombs, and he also dresses his women as if they're in Brittany. because he's already told Van Gogh that the Alesian women in France were considered some of the most beautiful women in France. But Gauguin told Van Gogh they have nothing to compare with the women in Brittany. And in fact, he also said, Arles is a scuzzy place, nothing like Brittany. So already there was a tension building up because Gauguin needed to assert himself all the time and be the authority. He paints this portrait of Van Gogh, Van Gogh painting sunflowers. Now the sunflowers weren't in season now, so a lot of this painting is based on drawings and imagination, though I imagine there was at least a drawing of Van Gogh that he used for this painting. When Van Gogh finally saw it, he said, "You've made me out to be a madman." A very unusual painting for Van Gogh. Remember, they're collaborating. Van Gogh was interested in them collaborating, in them imitating each other, taking motifs from each other's paintings. In this particular work, under the influence of Gauguin, he painted this in the studio for memory. This is a vineyard where the leaves are going red and the people are harvesting. And it does have resemblance to some of Gauguin's paintings. It was the only painting that Theo sold during Van Gogh's lifetime. This is Gauguin's painting of the same view, which is very strange because you wouldn't know that it was a vineyard. He's put women from Brittany doing the harvesting, and he's taken a drawing of a mummy, a Peruvian mummy that he saw in the museum in France, and put this image of the mummy in the foreground. So, anyone seen the movie Heaven's Gate by Snobel? Only you, Wendy? I thought you saw it as well, Robert, no? Well, Wendy, you will remember the scene where Van Gogh does this painting and Gauguin is drawing. That scene totally misrepresents what happened. What actually happened is, this is Madame Junot, who herself suffered from serious mental problems where she would have these attacks. And so she really empathized with Van Gogh, and she was his most loyal friend throughout his whole time in Arles. She's one of the proprietors of the night cafe. Van Gogh arranged for her to pose for the two of them. And Van Gogh did this painting in an hour. Yes. And Gauguin did this drawing. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. And later, Van Gogh would do this painting. He totally changed the colors. The drawing is exactly the same. Or almost exactly the same, but he's added all this color, probably under the influence of Gauguin. Gauguin, meanwhile, did this drawing in the hour, which he adapted to make this painting, which I showed you last week. Van Gogh's Night Cafe, done somewhat differently by Gauguin, and he's put Madame Junot in the foreground. He's influencing Van Gogh, but if you think about it, Van Gogh is also influencing him, though he might not admit it. But the tension between the two of them grew, and eventually there was that incident, which we only have Gauguin's word for what happened, where they were arguing and Gauguin had indicated that he might be leaving the Yellow House soon. And he goes for a walk to cool off and turns, he hears footsteps behind him, turns around, and there's Van Gogh with a blade razor in his hand, approaching him. And Gauguin apparently stares him down and Van Gogh flees and Gauguin decides to check into a hotel for the night. Van Gogh goes back to his room, as we know, cuts off his ear, takes it to the prostitute who both he and Gauguin knew, and who Gauguin had kind of won her favor away from Van Gogh to some degree. And he says, keep this as a memory of me. And goes back to his room and collapses, remembers none of this at all. He's found the next day bleeding profusely and committed to the hospital in Arles. But as soon as he's able, he's painting again. And this is, I think, a very, very good painting of the interior of a hospital. He also paints, he spends time in the asylum there, and he paints the garden. Now, he actually goes back to the Yellow House and spends some time there, but has another mental breakdown, and the townspeople start to get really worried and petition the city to ask him to leave. And he, meanwhile, communicates with Theo, who arranges for him to be a resident at an asylum not that far from Arles in Saint-Remy. This is his room in Saint-Remy. It's a small room, but with some great views out the windows, and a very sympathetic staff who let him wander the gardens. They don't allow him beyond the gardens at first till they're sure he's stabilized, but he does this magnificent painting in the gardens. You can see his sister Wilhelmina once said that he understood the secret heart of flowers. And I think that's quite true. What's interesting is this is highly expressive, but look at the detail, the way he's, the attention he's put into each individual flower. These were more purple originally, by the way. The red faded. So they've become much bluer than they were in the original painting. Okay, this is the caretaker at the asylum who becomes a really good friend, actually, of Van Gogh. And his name is Francois Trabou. And this is actually Van Gogh's copy. The original has been lost. He also painted Francois's wife. And, you know, we're always told how no one understood Van Gogh's work. But the interesting thing is, ordinary people obviously understood it. They were willing, all these people were willing to sit for portraits, which they would get. They obviously appreciated his work. It was the buying public who took a while understanding him and accepting him. And of course, it didn't take that long. I mean, he only had such a short career. There was not time for people to catch up with him. This is the garden of the asylum. I visited there. Beryl and I visited, and actually we both painted a painting nearby. The landscape there is really very much like he painted it. Certainly he has his own expressiveness and something that's totally characteristically his, but his work is grounded in a real sense of the actual place. This was the view out his window, which he painted repeatedly at different seasons, and one of his, I think, great works. And he manages to get both two plants which were new to him in the south, the cypresses and the olives, into the same painting here. The mountains behind are very much like, they're small mountains, but they're very strange looking. and his depiction of them is quite accurate. But you can see how his work is becoming, partly maybe as a result of his experience of these attacks and his own sense of the impermanence of his situation, his works are becoming more rhythmic. A sort of movement and wind passes through them. Now, when he can't paint outside, either because he's not allowed to or because of the weather, he has a huge collection of his favorite artists, prints of his favorite artists. And he starts using them as the basis of paintings. He says to his brother that though the drawing is largely not his own, the color is, and he's like a musician who interprets Beethoven. And this is, you probably recognize it, based on Millet, but a very Van Gogh interpretation. Incredibly simple and powerful use of color. And he's also picking up some of the detail that is in the print very effectively. He interprets Rembrandt. He leaves, this is the raising of Lazarus. He's left out Christ, but, and just concentrated on Lazarus and the immediate family here. Very interesting color. And of course, wherever he can put an intense sun in the painting, he will do it. This is an interpretation of Delacroix, Delacroix Pietà. And he commented to his brother that he did this, I think, in one day without taking any measurements, just copying directly onto the canvas. This is but he also does variations on his own drawings. If you remember, Worn Out is now titled Eternity's Gate, and has gained, I mean, it's no longer just worn out. There's a sense, to me, there's a sense of intense grief in this painting as well. Look at the sense of tension up here. Theo commented to him that he thought some of these paintings based on his or other people's drawings were some of his best work. And this, of course, his final and most famous night painting, which I don't believe was painted from a night scene. This is his own invention. At this point, because you know, he worked with Gauguin, doing stuff from his imagination, he's much freer in what he can do and what he can invent. He wrote to his brother, I didn't find the quote, but I remember it from reading his book, and maybe you remember the exact quote, Julie, but he said to his brother when he was painting this picture, he said, well, he wrote, that I've been thinking that maybe when we die, we travel as you would take a train from here to Paris to a distant star and arrive on another planet in another life. He had a really intense imagination, and that's kind of is a combination of a real understanding of science and also Eastern religion, because he was a really voluminous reader, and he also read a lot of philosophy.
As I remember that quote, I don't remember it specifically, but I remember noticing it when I read it because it was pretty powerful. But I interpreted it, or my sense of it was that he talked about life and death as sort of two halves of the whole.
Okay. Yeah.
My impression was almost that he was saying maybe life isn't more significant than death.
Right. right. That you
And
could
he
have a
did have
number,
this metaphor of traveling in there somewhere,
right,
but
and of actually arriving somewhere else and existing there. Yes, yeah, yeah. I'm sorry that I didn't find that particular quote, but it was close to what we just said. And it did stick out. I mean, it stuck out. I mean, I remember it after all these years because there was this very deep philosophical and kind of wondering side to him. He saw life as a whole as a pilgrimage. He never, he totally gave up on organized religion. He couldn't stand it. He thought it was really hypocritical. But he didn't give up on this religious urge, which he'd, you know, absorbed with his mother's milk in his family. And it was also the thing that gave him consolation in his loneliness. This is not, he did a whole bunch of olive trees which were growing behind the asylum. They're worth looking up. I only showing you this one. And I'm showing you this one because he saw this as a companion to Starry Night, which is interesting. And these strange rock formations behind are very close to what you see if you go to the asylum, which, by the way, is still an asylum and which tries to treat people with art therapy. Well, to me, one of his most powerful self-portraits, and you can see, again, this sense of fluidity, this sense of him almost underwater at this point. And emerging almost from the paint surface that's writhing and a very and a surprisingly limited palette. His palette is changing. He's not generally using the same high contrast or high color that he was using in Arles. Around this time, he gets word from Theo, who, by the way, has now married a woman, Jo, that he has a nephew named Vincent, just born. And he's very excited. And he paints this painting for his nephew, Vincent, for the room, for the child's room. And the family actually loves it and treasures it for the rest of their lives. It's quite an amazing painting, actually. And something about this that's interesting in comparison to the other paintings we've been seeing is the calm and stillness of it. Perfect painting for a little child. And very realistic too. It's got an almost photographic quality to it. And not easy to do if you think about it, to get all the correct spaces between all these branches and then place all these flowers convincingly in the context of this painting. Also a very strong reflection of Japanese art. So he grew tired of being in the asylum, and he was having a period of stability. And so Theo arranged for him to stay in Auvers-sur-Oise, which had become an artist colony. If you remember, Daubigny had settled there, and Van Gogh would eventually paint his garden. Dr. Gachet was actually Pizarro's doctor, and it was Pizarro who recommended Gachet and Auvers-sur-Oise to Theo, because Theo was in very close contact with all the Impressionist painters and selling them at this point. This is the first of several variations of a portrait of Gachet, and in my mind, the best. Gachet became a very close friend. And had an immense admiration for Van Gogh. He was a painter himself, and he copied a lot of Van Gogh's paintings to try and understand them, which of course creates confusion because are these originals? Are they copies by Van Gogh, or are they Gachet's copies? We don't always know. I mean, there's a lot of debate about this. He also has a daughter, and Van Gogh.
To interrupt, but I'm just curious about one thing related to those copies. So Van Gogh signs them all, Vincent. I mean, copies wouldn't have had his signature, would they?
No, they wouldn't. But it's well known in the trade that his signature will be found if necessary.
Oh, you mean that it could have been added later?
Yes.
Gotcha.
This is Dr. Gachet's daughter at the piano. Van Gogh loved music. In fact, there was a time early on where he takes music lessons, but he never really gets very good at the piano because he's always associating notes with colors and interrupting his lessons, going off on this relation of the note he's just played or heard to some color. And he writes actually to his brother about doing this painting. If I can find the, I have my notes kind of disorganized here. Yesterday and the day before, I painted Mademoiselle Gachet's portrait, which I hope you will see soon. The dress is pink. Doesn't look too pink here, but anyway. The wall in the background green with orange spots, the carpet red with green spots, the piano dark violet. It is 1 meter high by 50 centimeters wide. It is a figure that I painted with pleasure, but it is difficult. He has promised to make her pose for me another time at the small organ. I will do one for you. And he also paints her in the garden, Gachet's garden. And he gets away with putting her almost centrally in the painting. You can see how lyrical his painting is becoming at this time. And you get a sense that he's quite relaxed and happy. This is a peasant woman, and I think a lovely painting. Probably done in a few hours. I don't know very much about it. And farmhouses in Auvers-sur-Oise. He's getting very loose and relaxed. And I mean, look at this sky. It's unfinished, and yet it works in the context of this painting, suggesting a sky where the clouds are moving and breaking up and changing under the more permanent buildings below. So when he paints this church in Auvers-sur-Oise, he writes to his brother saying that it reminds him of the family church where his father would have preached in Nouenon. To me, it's an ambivalent painting. The church has, to me, a slightly threatening and disturbing aspect, which would be consonant with what he felt at this point about organized religion. He didn't really approve of it, and he felt that the interiors of churches were places of ignorance. Another very light-hearted, playful painting, which could almost be done by a 20th century painter. This painting, of course, is always associated with his death, but in fact, it isn't his last painting. Though it does suggest, with the crows and the darkening sky, some sort of impending disaster. And we'll never know. I don't think we'll ever know for sure if he shot himself or he was, as has been recently suggested, was accidentally shot by some teenagers. There's circumstantial evidence for that. He said he committed suicide, but he also said, don't blame anyone else. I chose to do this, which is kind of an ambivalent phrase. But this painting is not the end of his life. He continues painting some quite beautiful scenes, which now are in very close color harmonies. The strong opposites which he had adopted early on have given way to these close, quite beautiful rolling harmonies with a real sense of distance, despite the heavy textures that he's using. There's a wonderful dynamic in his paintings between very good perspective and the strong sense of surface. So there's this tension in his work that is part of their power. One of his last portraits, and this woman is, let me give her name because it's sort of important. I can find my notes. Oh yeah, Adeline Ravoux. She was the young daughter of the innkeepers where he was staying. They obviously liked him and were concerned about him. She says that the day he comes back wounded, Vincent walked bent, holding his stomach, again exaggerating his habit of holding one shoulder higher than the other. Mother asked him, Monsieur Vincent, we were anxious. We're happy to see you to return. Have you had a problem? He replied in a suffering voice, no, but I have. He did not finish, crossed the hall, took the staircase and climbed to his bedroom. I was witness to this scene. Vincent made on us such a strange impression that my father followed him up the staircase and listened at the door where he heard groans, at which point he called the doctor, and they discovered that he was seriously wounded. They called immediately for Theo, who took the train and arrived the next morning. It wasn't that far from Paris, and was at Van Gogh's bedside for the next 2 days. Van Gogh sat in his bed stoically smoking and talking a little to Theo. As I said before, he claimed to, when asked directly by the police, did you intend to commit suicide? He said, I suppose so, but don't blame anyone else, which is an odd thing to say, and is one of the reasons the most recent writers on his extended writing on his life, I'm looking for the title of the book. I'm sorry, today I'm a little disorganized with my pages. They bring up evidence suggesting that he was accidentally shot by a couple of kids playing with a gun. And there is circumstantial evidence for that, but we'll probably never know. But anyway, there was no one who could operate on him. The bullet had not hit a vital organ, and the shot was from very low, not where you would expect someone who was shooting themselves to shoot themselves. No gun was ever found. His story was that he'd gone out to the cornfield and shot himself, which is why it gets associated with his death. But in fact, his painting supplies were never found there, and a gun was never found anywhere. In any case, he develops an infection. There's no one who can operate on him. He becomes delirious and dies. His last words to his brother there is no end to despair. Theo falls into just terrible grief. Actually ultimately goes mad to himself and dies within 6 months, leaving Jo with an infant son and a massive collection of paintings, which she handles brilliantly. She takes on the task. She obviously shared Theo's concern for Vincent. It was Theo's life project, really. And keeps most of the paintings together. And Vincent, the junior, actually does the work and raises the money to build the museum in Amsterdam that houses much of Van Gogh's work. But before this happens, there's one little quote that I think is worth reading. On March 17th, 1901, 71 of Van Gogh's paintings were displayed at a show in Paris, and his fate, as a result, actually, of Jo's efforts, and I believe with the help of Signac, were displayed at a show in Paris, and his fame grew enormously. His mother lived long enough to see her son hailed as an artistic genius. Today, Vincent van Gogh is considered one of the greatest artists in human history. That's all I have to say. I'd be interested in any reactions, thoughts from you guys.